In this video, we're going to take a look at Atramentis Artist Brown. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This may have been a better received ink had I not just done Noodler's Chisholm Trail. If you haven't seen that one, check that out. This was not as good as that by far, but not that this is bad, just bad timing. It's a good ink, bad timing. This is a very red-leaning brown. It does give some tone variation by pen, and on a limited basis, can give a little bit of shading. Once again, had I not just done Chisholm Trail, this probably would have been much more interesting to me. Not that it's a bad ink. I just, as I look at it, it's supposed to be brown, much more red-leaning than I would like, and I just saw an amazing waterproof brown ink. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Diplomat Aero with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a little red-leaning brown with this. It's a little red-leaning, but it is still brown. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade fairly well in this fine nib. Take a look at the word achievement, where it starts like lighter, gets darker, lighter again, and dark at the T. I've been impressed twice in a row. I've had a permanent ink that shades well. Looking at the zoom nib, which is darker than the fine. No kidding. It does feather. No, I'm sorry. It doesn't feather. It's my second voiceover today. I normally don't do two in a day. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does offer little bits of shading like the E on time or the Y on entity, but it is very red looking. Looking at the music nib, it is not as dark as the zoom. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade about as well as the zoom does, which it does okay. Take a look at the word way on the second line. You see it goes lighter to a darker Y. This right in front of it, lighter to a darker S. But none of this shading is really stand out and huge, but it is a big deal considering that it's on a waterproof ink. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib. A Sailor 1911 Large with a zoom nib. A Sailor 1911 Standard with a music nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the soft fine nib, doing over. Looking at the fine nib, we get the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. Still a little red leaning on the brown, but it looks brown. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade, and it is shading very nicely. Take a look at of. Starting dark, gets light at the top of the F, dark into the bottom of the F. Assumptions starts light, but at the P gets much darker, so it does shade. Looking at the zoom nib, it is much darker than the fine. It is the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. I'm taking both of those to mean that this ink is bonding very quickly with the paper so that it happens before it has the chance to have a mishap. It does shade. It shades much better than it did on the Clairfontaine, and I think that is the fast bonding of the ink and the more absorbent paper working to our benefit. Looking at the music nib, we get a little bit lighter than the zoom, very close to the tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We don't get any feathering. We don't get any spread. We get a little bit of shading, nowhere near as much as on the zoom, but there are some spots. You can see it at the end of words and sometimes right at the very beginning, but nothing real stand out. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, while it is about the same darkness as it was on the Clairfontaine, we're definitely seeing it more red than brown here. A nice Atramentis artist red, except they have artist. Anyway, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It is not shading on this paper. It makes me wonder if it is the tone or the hyperabsorbency of this compared to the WritePad. Looking at the zoom nib, it is darker than we got with the fine, but it's really dull and washed out looking. It does have a tiny bit of feathering. It does have a tiny bit of spread. It does not have any shading. It does look kind of yuck and yuck. Looking at the music nib, first thing, more yuck, please. Oh, sorry. We get a little bit lighter than we had with the zoom nib, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering. You see it on Albert, you see it on Einstein, you see it on Einstein's. We do get a little bit of spread. It's manageable, the spread, to be quite honest. Same with the feathering. We do get a tiny bit of feathering shading that can occur, but the tone in general is full on yuck again. Looking at the back of the page, this is where some strength is coming with this ink because it has no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a little bit lighter a color than we had on the Clairfontaine. It's also showing the red a bit more than the Clairfontaine did. Now, it is not feathering or spreading. It is giving a few moments of shading. You can see it in the downstroke of space in the P, the up and down stroke of the D and on the third line. How about the P in space again on the third line? So it is shading, just not as well. Looking at the zoom nib, it is just a little darker, maybe a lot. No, let's just say darker. It's darker than it was with the fine nib. It is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not have any feathering. It does not have any spread. It does have a few moments that are darker, but I am not going to call it shading. Just a few moments that are darker. Looking at the music nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the Zoom, which is quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. The color itself is not a bad red, very uninteresting, though. It's not bad, it's just absolutely uninteresting to me. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. As a red, it's just kind of there. It could have been any color, to be honest. It's just putting words on a page at this point. Looking at the back of the page, it might have phoned in the color on that music nib, but the back shows no bleeding, no ghosting. It has shown up to really do a great job. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Black Stone Brown Baronia. Here is Califolio Inca Sol. Here is Colorverse Hubble Zoom. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Hazelnut Brown. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We're about to enter into fun categories with this because we know this paper is bad. It does feather, it does spread, it does shade. Sort of. There's darker spots. And those darker spots here always mean bad news. I expect the same. While it does have some darker spots, on the majority, this has been a darker tone for this ink, yet still red, not brown here. Looking at the Zoom nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the fine, as a red, not brown. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade, it does not look good as a tone on this page. I feel like this would be something you could do just to make someone really not like seeing your writing, not because it's red, because it's kind of ugly here. It should be brown. Looking at the music nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the Zoom. It does feather, does spread, does not shade. Still is an ugly tone on the page. I don't often really just say how ugly something like this is, but this is an ugly baby. Looking at the page underneath, you can see just how many spots have been circled because they bled through. This was more aggressive than Chisholm Trail, and seeing the back of the page, you understand why in the extreme amount of ghosting. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Geherban, their Rose Tendris. Here is a green ink by Monteverde, their Monteverde Green. Here is an orange ink by Monteverde, their Gemstone Topaz. Here's a blue-black ink by Platinum, blue-black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a tiny bit. It does spread a lot. It does not shade. Actually, the tone here is not horrible in this much darker red, except it's supposed to be brown. But we'll move forward. Looking at the zoom nib, much darker than it was with the fine. It does feather, it does spread. Both of those are expected in this case. Both of those aren't the end of the world. The best news about this is, in its darkest areas, it does have a bit of that brown there. The brown's back. I like brown inks. Why are you trying to hide it as a red? What in the world? Now, there's no shading here. We don't expect shading. Why should we on 20-pound copy paper? Looking at the music nib, it is a bit lighter than we got with the zoom. Just a bit, you might say. It's actually a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering and we do get spread, and neither of those are any kind of a surprise, and we do not get any shading. Still not a surprise. Looking more towards red than it is towards brown at this point. I know I have beaten that point to death, but what can you say when an ink says brown and looks red in the writing? I'm not talking about complaining about a swatch here. I'm talking about the writing. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Broader pens draw unwanted attention to the very red lean. Same if the pen is dry. So to really get a decent brown, I recommend going with a very wet fine, or not like a gusher of a fine, just a wet fine. Don't have to go overboard, but let's make this brown ink brown and not red. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you did, do all that YouTubery stuff. Thanks for watching.